75 or older? I said, yeah. She said, no, you don't need to take off your shoes. But I just sat here and did the math. And Chris Colfer has to take off his shoes for the next 53 years. This is not the first time I've spoken at this breakfast. I spoke at this breakfast way back in 1987, 25 years ago, when this convention had a different name, and it was in a different place, Washington, D.C., and I had blonde hair instead of gray. And it actually, that year, I checked this on the internet, that year had the largest turnout that it had ever had, 22,000 people. Not at the breakfast, but at the convention. Some of the speakers at the convention that year were Tip O'Neill, Arthur Ashe, Kurt Vonnegut, Dr. Seuss. They're all gone now, of course. And one of the other speakers at the Children's Book and Author Breakfast 25 years ago was Robert McCloskey. It was very tough to be the speaker after him. Not because he was a great speaker, he wasn't. But he got a standing ovation before he said anything. And of course, he's gone now too. Actually, my health is quite good. I don't plan to be gone anytime soon, and being here today feels like coming full circle after all those years. When I was here in 1987, I had written probably 12 books. It would be 5 more years and 5 more books until I wrote The Giver. I try, because I'm asked the question so often, to recall why I wrote a book that was so different from the then 17 books I had written up until that time. There were triggers, of course, small things that set my mind on a certain course, and I've told anecdotes about those things many times over the years, but they really are nothing more than triggers and anecdotes. The true reason that I wrote The Giver, I realize now, was actually the same reason I write every book, because I was wondering about something. I've never subscribed to the very popular admonition that is often given to beginning writers and was given to me when I was studying writing at Brown University in the 50s. They always tell you, and tell you still, to write what you know. I think it makes more sense to write what you don't know. To write what makes you uneasy, what you wonder about, what keeps you awake at night. When I sat down to write a new book in 1992, the book that would be eventually called The Giver, we had just gone through the first, what we sadly have to call the first war in Iraq. It's ironic that John mentioned that same period of time. That was a war in which my son took part. He was an Air Force pilot. And I remember that he wrote me, predated email, he wrote me from Saudi Arabia during those days. He was flying, he said, every day over the Gulf where the oil fields were burning. He said he looked down every day through that thick black smoke, and he thought, why do people do such terrible things to each other? And how do we put an end to it? Of course, that was an unanswerable question, but it was one that kept me awake at night. Still does. And that's what we do, those of us who write. We wrestle with those questions that we can't answer. And so I wrote The Giver, which was about human behavior, why people do what they do. And it was about human memory, how we learn from our own past, or, sadly, more often, how we fail to learn. But the book left other questions, or maybe it simply left the same question framed in different ways. And over the years that followed The Giver, I received first a trickle, and then a deluge, and eventually, still today, thousands of letters. Now it's emails mostly, from readers, asking those questions, asking and asking and asking. So eventually, I set aside the other books I'd been writing and turned my attention again to what my son had written to me. Why do people do such terrible things to each other? And how do we put an end to it? So the second book, the companion volume to The Giver, was published in 2000, Gathering Blue. That was 6 years after The Giver. And still, it wasn't enough. The readers still wrote to me, and they said, yeah, but what if, because the questions still weren't answered. So eventually I went back and reimagined it again. The third book, called Messenger, was published in 2004. That was 10 years after the publication of The Giver.